Good afternoon. Large data simulations are useful to predict fluid behavior around an aeroplane wing. Trying to simulate these vortices in the near wake and in combination of large Reynolds number is particularly challenging. Lombard et al. Used higher order finite element methods to simulate these kind of phenomena. In this image, the wingtip vortex is highlighted. The vortex in the light gray is the primary vortex, and the vortex in the blue is the secondary vortex rotating in the opposite direction. After simulating this data, this group was interested in analyzing the topology of this data. So let's examine the characteristics of the simulation data. In traditional linear finite element methods, the elements have straight edges and the simulation data is stored at the vertices and can be linearly interpolated anywhere in the element. In case of higher order elements, the elements can have curved edges. Here we show one type of higher order elements where the data is stored at the nodal points, where P number represents the polynomial order. On the right, we have a visualization of a derivative of higher order finite element data. Here we can clearly see the discontinuity at the element boundaries. Now let's see how topology can handle this kind of data. Most of the work done in topology is using piecewise linear interpolants. There are two main challenges to extend this work to higher order data. The first challenge is to find critical points for higher order interpolants. There has been some work done by Karl and Sionic to create the abstract framework, but it requires finding roots for higher order interpolants, which is a little hard. The second challenge is to deal with discontinuity at element boundaries. At this front, the current literature only shows how to deal with piecewise constant data. Hence, our goal is to evaluate the effect of the techniques that work as a stopgap between the derivative of higher order finite element data and the topological tools. So let's recap. We want to do topological analysis on derivative of higher order methods. Most of the current topological tools need continuity and low order data for analysis. Since there's a direct mismatch between the data and the input requirements of the topological tools, we need to transform the data to fit the topological tools. Our goal here is to explore and evaluate the effect of these data transformation methodologies on the topological analysis. So let's review the data transformation techniques that can be used to convert the higher order data into piecewise linear data. The first two methods evaluate the solution at specific locations. In these two methods, the solid lines indicate the mesh elements of the higher order data. For the technique on the left, we choose equispaced points to evaluate the solution. For the technique on the left, we choose equispaced points to evaluate the solution and create a structured grid data. For the technique on the right, we take the simulation mesh and subdivide the elements to create a new mesh. We then evaluate the solution on the new subdivided mesh. This way, we're creating more samples in the regions where there is high resolution in the mesh. The third methodology, we use a post-processing filter called the SIAC filters. Given an FEM solution UH, we convolve with the SIAC kernel KH to obtain the post-processed solution U star. These filters rearrange the data to increase the smoothness of the original solution. They are proven to preserve the accuracy or increase the accuracy of the original solution. One of the disadvantages of the SIAC filters is the high computational cost. To elevate some of the computational burden, we used L-SIAC filter, which has all the properties of the SIAC filter and is computationally cheaper than the traditional SIAC filters. To evaluate the data transformation methodologies, we conduct an empirical study on the analytical data. We create the analytical data. To create the analytical data, we selected a non-uniform triangular mesh. We choose an analytical function that has 8 critical points, two maximas and minimas in the corners, and then there are 2 other local maximas and minimas in the center. We then project the analytical data on the non-uniform triangular mesh to simulate the data output from their higher order FEM data. The projected solution has discontinuities at the element boundaries. I changed the color map in this region to highlight some of the discontinuities we have in the projected data. These discontinuities result in the sharp gradients in the element boundaries. So now let's look at the topology of the original analytical solution. Here we have the analytical function for reference. The persistence diagram for the analytical function is shown in the center. In this work, we don't just rely on the persistent diagram, we also summarize the critical points using persistent curves. By using persistent curves, what we are really trying to do is just count the number of persistent pairs and then how persistent and understand how persistent they are. On the right, we show the segmentations associated with the extrema of the contour tree. In this image, we filtered the segments only to show the segments associated with the contour tree. Since we are only showing the segments associated with the contour extrema, there are some regions which show up as gaps, and we just visualize them as gaps for now. To evaluate the data transformation methodologies, we did an empirical study on the projected data of the analytical solution. We did this using varying the method of transformations, playing around with the sampling rates, and examine the topological features such as persistence diagrams, persistence curves, and segmentations of the data. We made some interesting observations. So now let's look at some of them. We first explore the data created using the sampling methodology. The black line indicates the number of critical point pairs indicated by the original analytical function, and the green line indicates the number of critical points indicated by the projected solution, which is evaluated at 50 cross 50 equidistant points. Now, as we increase the number of evaluations to 200 cross 200 and then 500 to 500, 500 cross 500, the number of critical points increased with the increase of evaluations. Furthermore, when we take a closer look at the critical points near the original solution, we observed that with increasing the sampling, the critical points actually moved away from the original solution. We were surprised with this behavior, which was a little bit opposite to our intuition. We found these similar observations with the subdivided sampling method too. As we increased the number of subdivisions, the critical points increased. Furthermore, with the increase of subdivisions, the critical points also moved away from the original solution. In case of L-SIAC filter, interestingly, at some critical, there's slightly increase in the number of critical points, but when we observed at the actual critical points of the analytical solution, the increase of sampling rate actually brought the critical points closer to the original solution. Regarding the effect of these techniques on the segmentation boundaries, we observed for the segmentation boundaries of the sampled and subdivided were influenced by the underlying simulation mesh. Only in the case of L-SIAC filter, the segmentation boundaries were not influenced by the simulation mesh. Now let's look at the data set from an actual higher order FEM simulation. Here we show a simulation output of a counter-rotating vortex generated using higher order finite element methods. We took a small section of the data set highlighted by the red rectangular box. In this data set, the scientists simulated a strong primary vortex and observed there is a secondary vortex which rotates in the opposite direction. The scientists believe that there are other small, weaker vortices generated, but they are difficult to identify. Now let's look at the topological tools to see if these can help identify these vortex-like structures in the data set. Here we show the persistent diagram for the three methodologies. Our goal is to identify the plateaus in the graph, which could guide us in identifying the vortex features. Most of the plateaus are present on the high persistent region, so shown in the rectangular box. So let's focus on this region. In this data set, we have only two main features. We know that we have two main features at least. Hence, we would like to pick the threshold such that we can identify them. This is highlighted by the red horizontal line. In this case, we got lucky because we could pick one single persistent threshold that we can use for all the three techniques. So now let's examine the segmentation boundaries created with using this threshold. In this case, we observed all the three techniques identified similar regions for these two features, but the segmentation boundaries are different for all the three techniques. In case of sampled and subdivided methodologies, the boundaries were influenced by the simulation mesh. So now we change our aim to hopefully identify weaker persistent features also. So the first task we need to do is we need to pick a lower threshold while being fair to these three techniques. We tried to pick a persistent threshold that is effectively a bit of plateau, and we realized there's no single threshold we can use for all the three data sets. And moreover, it did not even give the same number of critical points. Since this was tricky to pick a single threshold for all the three, and to be fair, we just picked we picked different thresholds best suited for each particular methodology. Now let's look at the segmentation boundaries for each of these methodologies. In addition to applying the persistent threshold, we filtered the results to get rid of features which are very small in size. In case of the sampled methodology, we identify 4 features, but the feature shown in the top in orange doesn't really resemble a vertex-like structure. In case of subdivided methodology, we observe 2 features which resemble a vertex, and the other 2 features do not even have a consistent boundary. In case of L-SIAC methodology, we observed 5 features resembling a vertex, and the segmentation boundaries are consistent. In this work, we evaluated 3 data transformation methodologies. We did an empirical study on the topological features, using the topological features like persistent diagram, persistent curve, and segmentations. Some of the takeaways from these evaluations were, in the case of sampling and subdivided methodologies, increasing the sampling adversely affected the topological features. Mesh elements also affected the segmentation boundaries. The L-SIAC filter elevates these shortcomings, but comes at a higher computational cost. And I would be happy to take any questions on what technique I would recommend. We would like to thank all our collaborators and funding agencies for their support. Thank you.